All right. Well, welcome everyone to the third Hanover seminar of this season. My name is David Skoll. I'm a professor in the Department of Forestry, and I'll be moderating uh, today's seminar. A few announcements before we get into the seminar. First of all, the session here is being recorded using the Zoom record tool. So recommended that you turn off the video, but that's your choice for your own video. Also, I'd recommend very much that you, while listening to the presentation, go on mute, push your mute button so any interruptions on your side won't interrupt the speaker. And then we will have question and answer session at the end. And the way we've been doing it, and it seems to be fine, is for you to put your question in the chat. So chat to everyone your question, and then we'll ask the speaker, Dr. Stark, today to just review the questions as they come in through the chat envelope. And then lastly, experience suggests that if you, for optimal viewing pleasure, you put this on speaker view and minimize the speaker view, so you'll see Dr. Stark in the speaker window, small and not be cluttered by everybody else's views. So getting started, it's my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, who today is one of our own faculty members, Dr. Scott Stark. Scott has been at MSU since starting in 2013, and he has he came here from doing his PhD at the University of Biology. Dr. Stark has worked for at least a decade on the Amazon and is doing some very interesting work on the ecological aspects of tropical forest in the Amazon, this vast area of tropical rainforest and one of the most beautiful places in the world. And I think we'll hear a lot about that today in this presentation. It's a very contemporary issue today, and I think we have a lot to hear from Scott. So without further ado, I'm just turning it over to you, Scott, to take it away from here.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Emily as well, and Renee and Lauren and everybody involved with putting together the Hanover series. I really appreciate it. Also very happy to have this opportunity to talk to you all online and reach some people. It's a slight silver lining of our situation, reach some people that might not have been able to make it to the talk otherwise. So I'm going to be talking about forest-atmosphere interactions in a climate crisis. And I'm really going to, as Dave suggested, focus in on the Amazon forest and really give a talk that is canopy-centric, that talks about what goes on in the Amazon forest canopy and how that's important in the climate context. So before I get into, there we go. Before I get into the research end of this talk, I just want to start with this picture that I think is really useful for thinking about, from a broad perspective, the research that I do. I like this picture because it both alludes to our ability to view the forest from above and learn something about it. So this alludes to a remote sensing component of my work, but also it gives us enough detail that we can think about the leaf functions and microenvironments and dynamics that are going on within the canopy that influence its function. And a fun thing about this picture is there's actually a couple Easter eggs in it. There are two people that are visible in this picture. So if I zoom in, as this camera shot actually does, you can see Ariana Laporte here in the top of the tree. There she is climbing up into the tree. So she was working on my climbing team at the time that this film was being made. So actually this picture from the from the promotional flyer is actually also taken from inside this tree, this over 150-foot tall tree. And our team was supporting a component of a documentary on the global importance of water when these shots were taken. So I'll return to talking about research actually in the canopy later. I'm going to start with a broader perspective and motivate my work. So I would like to actually start at the mission of our college. So we're an agriculture and natural resources college. So we have a mission that is managing natural resources and food systems to meet diverse human needs in a sustainable manner. So I really like this mission. And I know that all of us think about forests in a natural resource context in this department and in our work. The first things that we think about, I think, are our forests as a resource for timber or wildlife or recreation. So I'm actually going to focus on a way of thinking about forests as a natural resource that's a little bit less traditional than that. And so I want to focus on the idea of thinking of healthy climate function as an essential natural resource. And actually forests are just critically essential to providing this healthy climate function. So we all know that the great challenge of our times, or at least one of the greatest challenges of our times, is global warming. So just drawing your attention, if I can, to this figure where you see global mean temperatures increasing from 1970. And this is, of course, creating major issues for agriculture and human societies around the world. So we know that forests are very important in moderating the climate and combating global warming. Another big aspect that's central to my research that I want to motivate from the get-go here is the idea that understanding forest ecology is essential to be able to manage for healthy climate function. And this is really because there's a feedback between climate, forest ecological dynamics like growth, reproduction, mortality, the forest state and its function, and then that influences the atmosphere. So this is a key loop that we need to understand to be able to manage for healthy climates. And finally, this is also an opportunity for us to think about how biodiversity or functional diversity can promote the healthy climate function. Okay, so I think this is actually a perspective, this natural resource perspective of climate function in forests is one that our students are extremely interested in. So the current generation in many surveys and in action, in perspective, is a sort of climate activist generation. So we know that our students are very interested and concerned about climate change. It might be the defining issue for them. And this comes up in courses like forest ecology that I teach. Students are very interested to know how forests exactly influence the climate and want to be part of the solution. And so providing a detailed perspective on that is something that I'm very happy to elaborate in my teaching role in our department. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more about how forests are important to the climate. So I want to start talking about forest-climate interactions. In case I have any students in here right now, you might get something like this on an exam. I might ask you to tell me how these two systems are connected. If we have forests on the left of the screen and the atmosphere on the right, they are, of course, connected. Forests are impacting the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is impacting forests. I might also ask you to give me some details about this. And so, of course, there are many, okay, there we go, many aspects to these connections. And so if we just start with the forest impacting the atmosphere, we know, of course, that the carbon cycle is a big part of this. Forests take up and give off carbon. Also, evapotranspiration leads to the formation of clouds. Aerosols, important for clouds as well. Heat fluxes that drive patterns of pressure gradients and circulation in the atmosphere. So there are many impacts, and we can actually think about that in a little bit more direct of a context here in this picture that I quite like. that gives you a broad perspective on the atmosphere and also the Amazon forests. So the green that you see there and that river that you see, that's in the Amazon. There's a lot going on in this picture, but I just want to use it to illustrate the idea of the importance of the forests that cover Earth's surface and in essentially modulating the atmosphere. So we have incoming solar radiation. This is our rainbow shortwave radiation. It interacts with the atmosphere and the surface, and it drives the carbon cycle and the water cycle, drives photosynthesis, provides the energy for evapotranspiration, which we can also think of as a latent heat flux. And of course, we also have things like sensible heat flux, which is temperature changes. Albedo, that's a reflection of some of this radiation, which is impacted by clouds and also the features of the surface. And of course, the forest releasing aerosols, or in the case at the bottom of the screen, land conversion of forests releasing smoke particles also play important roles in the atmosphere. So that's a quick cover of the forest impacts on the atmosphere. On the other side, we know that there's a lot of impacts as well. So starting with things that we're familiar with, rainfall, temperature, humidity, radiation, that are all important to plant growth. You can also think about seasonality, multi-year patterns like the El Nino cycle, extremes, droughts, and heat waves. And this final case really drives a coupled ecological response that we're seeing around the world now, which is forest die-offs, forest transitions, associated fires. So I want to talk about that for a second. So we have this global pattern and crisis of forest die-off. This is a paper that highlights places where there are documented die-offs, understanding the true geographical context of the impacts of climates on forest die-off is an active area of research, but at least we know these are places where they've been documented. And so I want to highlight the Amazon. So we have this big circle in the Amazon. And so one thing that the Amazon is impacted by in our current era are extreme droughts. These are typically associated with El Nino events, although not exclusively. In 2005 and 2010, we had large droughts in the Amazon. These figures represent that, where you see the red actually is an extreme drought condition. And that picture highlights a dried out Rio Negro during one of these droughts. So we can ask, what's the effect on the forest? And we have a network of forest plots in the Amazon. It's called Rainfall. So here is a paper reporting on just the effect of the 2005 drought that used these forest plots and repeated measurements in them to quantify carbon impacts. Found a 10% increase in tree mortality and decreases in the carbon stock in this forest. So this is a climate-driven ecological change. Okay, so if we think about all of these things in totality, we have something that I like to think of as a coupled ecological atmospheric dynamic system, and it must be thought of in totality, or it can be thought of in totality. So I actually want to keep moving forward with understanding how important this coupled system is, and talk about particularly the role of forests in the future of the climate. So forecasting is, of course, a major concern today, understanding what trajectory we're on, how carbon mitigation can act to reduce warming, et cetera. So in order to understand this, we have to include this dynamic between forests and the atmosphere. And what research shows is that forests can be a major climate solution. We have a strong sink for carbon, so forests are taking up carbon globally. But whether or not that sink will persist in the future truly hinges on, in major part, whether tropical forests will be a carbon sink or become a major carbon source. So one thing that we know is that tropical forests are very volatile in their contribution to cooling the atmosphere by taking up carbon, and in fact are very sensitive to hot droughts. So to add some more context, tropical forests store something like a quarter of terrestrial carbon, and if they're lost, they could increase warming even within this century by 1 to 2 degrees C. So a lot is at stake And of course, we also don't want to forget about the other cooling function beyond carbon that they have, which is major cooling from evapotranspiration and contributions to the hydrological cycle. Okay, so that's my motivation for the importance of tropical forests. And so I want to focus in on my primary research now, which is the fate of the Amazon forest. So this is the largest tropical forest region, and is one of the places that we think is at the greatest risk of passing some sort of climate change induced forest die-off and tipping point associated. So I'll go through 4 parts of my work following this. I'll tell you about the ecological response of the Amazon to climate change and focus on the role of soil water environments. Then I'll talk about the implications of Amazon forest degradation, particularly savannization, the conversion to a savanna-like state, and associated fire and climate feedbacks. And I'll tell you about a broad program that I've been developing throughout much of my career, which is canopy ecology and the use of remote sensing to understand these ecological dynamics. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about my efforts to do some public policy and engage broader audiences. So throughout, I also want to address this issue of thinking of forests in the natural resource context is providing critical healthy climate function, ask how resilient forests are in providing this function, and how ecological processes are critical to this, and how forest functional diversity plays a role. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so let me give you just a little bit more background about the Amazon in particular. So here we are focused in on the Amazon forest. There are 2 predominant narratives about the future of the Amazon. One is that carbon stocks will continue to increase. The Amazon forest will act as a sink for carbon. This is due to a mechanism that is essentially the fertilization of tree growth by increased CO2 concentrations from fossil fuel emissions. And so in this case, it allows trees perhaps to be more productive and more water use efficient, which could increase the carbon stock. And so associated with this, we would expect, although there are some impacts on the evapotranspiration of forests, we expect a more healthy hydrological state in the Amazon as forests, if anything, get larger, okay? So this would also support a major climate function, this sort of regional scale hydrological mechanism that is of growing, our understanding of its importance is growing right now. So this is the idea of rivers in the sky, so the transport of moisture from the tropical Atlantic inland into parts south in South America that also help maintain the function of this forest. Okay, so the other perspective is that the increasing severity, intensity, and frequency of hotter droughts will kill trees, allowing the Amazon to give off carbon. Sea stocks will decrease, as this red arrow indicates, and the Amazon will become a source of carbon to the atmosphere and increase warming. So think to this example that I gave where we saw after the 2005 drought, we saw losses in carbon stocks. And so we also know that associated with these drought events, we actually can have an exacerbation of land conversion, and particularly fires burning into mature forest from land use change. Also driving a further loss of forests. We expect a decreased hydrological cycle in the Amazon, and perhaps these rivers in the sky will start to run dry as a result of all of this, leading to forest collapse. So this is a key issue in these perspectives. Although the mechanisms behind them aren't completely mutually exclusive, it's really important to know which one of these things is going to dominate in the years to come. And I really wanted to work on this from a broad perspective and address this question particularly, and ask, is resilience or forest loss going to be the future of the Amazon? And I wanted to do that in a context working with close collaborators and leaders in Brazil. So particularly working with colleagues that are pioneers in the study, so far mostly in the field of plant function over soil water variation in the Amazon. So that's Flavia Costa, who is a senior plant ecologist at the Institute for Amazon Study, Juliana Schietti, who's a new assistant professor at the Federal University of the Amazon. I also want to highlight a leadership role of my postdoc here at MSU, Marielle Smith. So in working on this, we realized that variations in soil water environments might be key to understanding the resilience in the future of the Amazon forest. So let me talk a bit more about that in a minute. But first I'll say this is in the context of us putting together a proposal for the NSF that I'm the lead PI on. And so actually this proposal was funded in late 2019. So this is a new project in the lab. Include here this link to, you can go see the story if you want more details in MSU Today, but I'll tell you more about it right now. So here are the key motivating factors and ideas behind this proposal. So first of all, most of what we know about forest drought response is from deep soil water table forests. Okay, so these are upland forests. This is where most of our forest plots are in the Amazon. However, much of the Amazon is actually waterlogged forest with very shallow water tables where the inundation of soil water actually limits tree growth. So we wonder, could drought dry out these waterlogged forests and actually allow them to become more productive? In this case, we could think of these forests as being some sort of Amazon refugia that are resilient to climate change droughts. So in summary, this proposal, the idea is we will now vigorously investigate this other side of tropical forest drought, okay? So I will tell you some more about our specific hypotheses in a minute. I want to give you a little bit more background first, though. So to understand the soil water question, I want to start with a perception that many people that work in the Amazon sort of have. We all know that environmental variation is very important in the Amazon, but sometimes it is tempting to think of it as a large, flat, wet area, even for people working there. And indeed, if you look at this topographical variation, you see that it's not very large by a broader perspective, ranging from 100 to 500 meters. But the topographical variation that is present is extremely important to the soil water environments, and there's a lot of variation. And so we actually have locally high areas that are often clay-rich plateaus associated with deep soil water tables, and valleys and broader low areas that are sandy fluvial soils, which are typically very shallow water tables, okay? So the other big thing to understand is that there's major variation in rainfall patterns across the Amazon. It's not just one big wet tropical rainforest. There's variation in the total rainfall, which you see on the left. There's also variation in the seasonality, which you see on the right. Actually, the seasonality is extremely variable. We have regions of the Amazon that have up to 6 months of almost no rain a year, so that's a very seasonal tropical wet forest in that case. These things together contribute to significant variations in the water table. So I'm showing you here a product that's a combination of model and data from a really nice paper by Miguel Machado and Fan. And so on the left, you can see flood heights. So these are actually places where rivers have burst their banks and we have flooding. This is typical in the Amazon, but I mostly want to call your attention to the water table depth. You can see those blue and purple colors indicating very superficial, shallow water table depths. And we see much of the Amazon, as seasonality moves around, is characterized by these shallow water table depth forests. And in fact, we can see that more specifically if we look at the, the seasonal, the annual averages, which is the figure now on the left. And in fact, we have about 30% of the Amazon being characterized by shallow water tables that are less than 5 meters. Okay, so let me tell you a bit about our hypotheses and how we're tackling this problem. So of course, we were going to get into the field this summer, but the epidemic has us delayed. We're making good use of this time working on a review paper, really trying to wrap up our concepts going into the project and including information about what's known today. And getting started with some analyses that I'll tell you about. So to motivate this, let's talk about our hypotheses. So we can contrast shallow water table depth forests on the low end of this, this hill slope that you see here. Hope you like my weird collage picture. On the right, we have deep water table depth forests. So we can think about a typical Amazon forest dry season. We might have a water table represented down here at the bottom that looks something like this. We have this aerated soil zone, the Vedas zone. This is good for plant growth as long as there's enough water available sort of at the interface with the water table, as is pictured here. So this is good in the upland, in the deep water table depth forest. We see actually in the lowland that we have these superficial shallow water tables, which is creating a limited aerated soil zone. That's okay for growth. It's the fact that it's limited is not good. So we might expect moderate canopy production, moderate tree function during this dry season in the shallow water table depth lowlands, high canopy production up on the plateau as those trees benefit from ample water available, but also a large Veda zone. So what happens in the wet season? Well, the soil water table starts to fill up. We actually see in the shallow water table depth region, we have very little aerated soil. This is very bad for growth, and that's ultimately because soil anoxia suppresses root function and therefore suppresses growth. Tree roots need to be able to breathe. So we could expect very low production during these times in these shallow forests, while in the uplands, there's still a large aerated zone and tree growth is able to continue well. Okay, so let's think about moderate drought. So this is similar to the dry season case, but I've moved the representation of the water table down a bit, indicating that it's drier than typical. This is a regular case for droughts in the Amazon, at least how we think about them now. And so now we have a larger aerated soil zone that extends further into the shallow water table depth forest. And we expect that deep-rooted trees, particularly larger trees in the uplands, actually still are able to gain access to soil water. In this case, we expect the highest possible canopy production in the lowlands because they actually still have water available, but also have a lot of aeration. Moderate canopy production in the uplands, as some smaller trees perhaps are drought stressed, as I highlight here. But we have production resilient due to stress tolerant trees. And so again, this is perhaps the best time for growth for shallow water table depth forests. This is our hypothesis, at least. So finally, finally we have a severe drought. So here I've represented the water table being very low. We have low water table, extremely water limited. And so we expect this is bad for forest everywhere, but we think it might actually be worse for the shallow water table depth forest. So why? We actually also expect it could be bad for the uplands, but why do we think it might be worse for the shallow water table depth forest? Well, we know that there are no deep roots in these communities because of that anoxia and shallow water table depth. That means that there's less significant history of drought. Forests lack the functional adaptations and may be severely impacted. This is our hypothesis. Some drought resilient strategies might sort of keep things rolling in the uplands, but that's an open question. And so again, I want to highlight that these are all hypotheses at the moment. we're looking at the evidence for all of them now in a sort of review context, but we need more primary research to answer this. Shallow water table depth forests remain understudied in the field, particularly relative to the uplands. This is changing thanks to the work of my collaborators on this project, who have been hammering away at this for a decade or more now, establishing forest plots in major new networks that sample this gradient of variation. And so I'll just highlight some early results from parallel work by them. So this isn't work by me, this predates the new project, but it's actually just from a paper that was accepted, I think, this weekend. So this is an interaction plot showing tree diameter growth on the left and tree mortality on the right. And so because it's an interaction plot, these are sort of unscaled variables, so don't worry too much about the exact numbers. But the thing to highlight is the slopes of the relationships. So the red lines in both cases for growth and mortality represent deep water table depth forest. The blue lines are shallow water table depth forest. And so you can see that the red line significantly differs from zero, so there's a significant slope in both cases. In the case of diameter growth, this decreases as drought severity increases. In the case of tree mortality, this increases as drought severity increases in deep water table depth forests. So this is really consistent with a moderate drought scenario in our hypotheses, as we suggested, where essentially the shallow water table depth forest is, in this case, it looks like unaffected by these differences in drought severity because it always has enough water, while the deep water table depth forest is seeing some impact of changes in drought severity because it's experiencing greater changes in the soil water status. Okay. So there's no hint of any sort of tipping point for the shallow water table depth forest in the study, but perhaps we don't have a strong enough drought to consider. And so in any event, we're gaining a lot of information from these forest plots, and we'll gain more in this new project. Okay, so the other thing I want to highlight is hot off the presses work that is very preliminary from my student, Natan. So this is Natan Gonsalves. He's a PhD student with us. And so we've been working on a preliminary analysis, working out the kinks in some of the remote sensing side of this project. And so I'm going to talk about two different sources of information about forest productivity that are available from multispectral remote sensing that's actually spaceborne. So the first is MODIS EVI. So EVI is Enhanced Vegetation Index. It's a measure of canopy greenness and a metric of canopy production. So we can calculate that at these large scales from MODIS, 1 kilometer resolution. You can look at it at much finer scales, 20 meter resolution, although at a lower frequency temporally with the Sentinel-2. And so we looked at both of these data sources in a preliminary analysis here along this transect in the Puru River, which is an area of shallow water table depth forest predominantly, but also with some upland regions in the central Amazon. So the first thing I'll show you is the EVI signal over 2 years. So we can see months 1 through 12 twice over. And also I will show you data from a river level monitoring station, which we're actually going to take as a proxy for soil water depth changes. So the idea is that as the river height changes, so does the soil water table depth, perhaps with some lag, right? So, but they should be related. And so actually when we correlate these two, if we introduce a 1 month time lag, we get an extremely strong correlation, as you see on the right side of your screen, between EVI and river level. And this is consistent with the idea that high anoxia decreases production in these forests. So high river levels means high water table depth would mean high soil anoxia. Okay, so we can actually delve in a bit more and look at the pattern on the fine spatial resolution, looking at just images of areas along the Peru River, where we have this, this representation of EVI. And I'll show you partial residual plots showing the relationship between EVI and the elevation, so they're ranging from 30 to 55 meters, and then the river height ranging from 10 to like 22 meters. So we get the relationships that you would expect. So we have an increasing relationship between EVI and elevation overall. So that means that the plateau forests here are producing overall more during the season in this shallow water table depth region. And we actually also see that as river height goes up, EVI decreases as we expect there's a more significant impact of anoxia. So the thing that's really interesting actually is to look at the interaction between river levels and elevation. So if you look at EVI versus the height of the position on the plateau or in the low areas, we see that when the river level is low, there's very little change in EVI over this elevation gradient. But as the river level goes up, we see that the EVI really starts to drop off in shallow regions, and we expect that this is related to some sort of anoxia shutdown. And so this is consistent as a preliminary analysis with our overall hypothesis, but there's a lot more to do. I'm going to do this in larger scales and convince ourselves that we don't have any sort of artifactual impacts. One thing that we can do with this that's pretty exciting that we'll be trying to develop moving forward is using this relationship to try to predict and to assess what goes on during droughts. So during droughts, the river level goes down, and we actually have data for that. So because we now see that high river levels decrease greenness, and thus we think growth in this region, more low levels should actually promote growth and cause something that we call green up, which has been observed before in response to Amazon droughts, has been perplexing to people in the past because it looks like the forest gets more productive sometimes when there's a drought. This would indicate resilience to drought if it's really true. So we can actually predict that there was a green up associated with both droughts in 2010 and 2015 from this model. But then if we actually look at the data, what we find is that, well, in 2010 there was a green up in this region, so that's as expected. But in 2015 there was not. And so why not? We expected there should have been one. Well, perhaps it's because in 2015 we actually had a very hot drought. So unlike 2010, 2015 was extremely hot. This actually really increases the drought stress associated with this event because it just increases the potential, the water pressure deficit in the air. So it increases the stress experienced by the trees. So perhaps this is an indication that there is eventually some sensitivity in these shallow water table depth forests. And we'll be exploring that more as we go forward. In the interest of time, I'll be very quick about this, but I just want to highlight some major activities that are going to consume a lot of my efforts over the next 3 years or so related to this project. One of them is actually going to be installing new canopy function monitoring towers in shallow water waterlogged sites in the central Amazon. So we're going to put up 2 new towers that are going to look something like this. This is actually our Tapajos tower. So these things are 65 meters, they reach above the forest, and at the beginning they're going to have optical monitoring of canopy function. And so we're actually installing them here in this major region of inundated anoxic soil in the central Amazon. So there's a lot of other components of this project. I'm going to kind of buzz over this one to speed things up. But I do want to say that ultimately we're going to be trying to tie this all together to look at the effects of water table depth variation broadly to understand how areas that might actually be in some ways advantaged by some level of drought will contribute to the overall resilience of the system and characterize their potential different sensitivities and how that impacts the potential for the Amazon to pass forest loss tipping points and contribute to global warming in the future. Okay, so let me tell you about, just quickly, about work that I've recently done on the question of savannization while we're on the topic of potential tipping points. So I'll just return to this idea that our worst case scenario is actually forest loss in the Amazon. And so I actually want to highlight work by Dave Skoll right now. So this is a paper that just came out in Science that Dave Skoll is the second author on, that's adding to this very new understanding that the amount of forest that has been degraded in the Amazon by things like logging, forest burning, proximity to forest edges is much larger than has been understood in the past. So this is essentially rivaling the amount of forest, or and perhaps even surpassing the amount of forest that has been logged and lost and converted. So these degraded forests are a major part of forest change in the Amazon. And we know that this process is actually, so that's data that goes up to, I believe, 2014. We actually have a recent uptick in this, and so we're having more degraded forests as we speak, with major changes going on in the Amazon right now, which I'm sure many of you are aware of from the news. So we were actually funded years ago by the NSF to look at the consequences of forest change for broad scale climate patterns, including teleconnections to other regions, like asking how changing the Amazon will affect rainfall and temperature and climate in other regions. And so as part of that project, we realized that we really need to understand better what the consequences of forest degradation are in the Amazon for the atmosphere. So I'm going to report on that study right now. So this is something that's sort of hot off the presses. It just came out a week ago or so, reframing tropical savannization, linking changes in canopy structure to energy balance alterations that impact climate. It's the paper. We mixed a study with some field data and a review of literature and a new conceptual framework in this innovative viewpoints paper framework from Ecosphere. And so one of the cool things in this paper was that we worked in the unique matrix of savanna and forests that are in the central Amazon, which is otherwise a rainforest region. And that's actually pictured here from I believe this is a fire from last year, actually. This is news coverage from just the other week. And here's one of our collaborators being interviewed in this news coverage, which is actually related to this paper. So this is Jose Mauro of the Federal University of Western Para. Okay, so what we did in this paper was contrast a historical viewpoint that has essentially understood the atmospheric impacts of mature forest and savanna through long-term monitoring, with the need to develop a better understanding of the degraded forest states that can help us understand whether or not we'll suffer savannization. So that's the long-term conversion of degraded states into an open ecosystem associated with the emergence of fire, or whether or not these states will be able to regenerate. And so we want to work on quantifying all of these atmospheric processes. And so we actually deployed a rapid assessment to try to get into some of these forests that are quickly changing to better understand what their contributions to the atmosphere are. And then we synthesize this all into this framework. So this is my favorite paper figure. So here's how I distilled it when it got tweeted out by the Ecosphere the other day. So I said degraded tropical forest. We argue that linking observable canopy structure change with energy balance alterations is key to predict resilience to additional degradation and ultimate forest recovery or collapse, that is savanization. So just to give you a very quick tour of what this figure says, it looks complicated, but the idea is actually quite simple. So we can have two time steps, a step of degradation, where we have forests being degraded by some disturbance like a fire. That changes the local energy balance, which changes microclimates in the forest. And this can impact the potential of future disturbances like more fires or severe drought impacts that kill trees to drive the forest in one direction or the other towards collapse or recovery. And so this just simply argues that we need to consider that feedback as well as the one that we more typically think about, which is the large-scale climate feedback. It also highlights a role for remote sensing, and I will quickly tell you a little bit about my remote sensing program next, which is oriented towards linking forest structure that we can observe with new remote sensing technologies with the energy balance consequences of changes in that forest structure, which would allow us to use remote sensing to monitor this process and build models and better understanding of how sensitive degraded forests are and how likely they are to recover. Okay, so I'll move on to the final research section of the talk. I'll go a little bit quick. I do want to make sure that I can end on the public policy note. So I apologize if I blast past a slide or two. Okay, so this is a program that I've been developing in my research for many years. I could give a much longer talk on it, so I'm just going to highlight it quickly. So this is a program of canopy ecology and remote sensing approaches to understand the future of forests in a changing climate. And so this dates back actually to my undergraduate days when I first learned about this new technology, LiDAR, when you can use lasers to scan forests and gain detailed three-dimensional information. And so on the left, these are images I borrowed from colleagues and collaborators from a paper you see referenced down there. And so on the left, we have a sort of vertical view of a few trees. You can really see the forest structure. On the right, we have a synthesis of LiDAR data and a multispectral approach that gives information about the spectral characteristics of the leaves in the illuminated portion of the canopy. So ever since I found out about this source of data, I've been intrigued with what you can do with it. And I basically immediately started thinking about the potential to resolve ecological questions with it. I think that this potential really breaks down in two ways. One is the ability to reveal stand characteristics, including forest demographics and forest dynamics. So here's a vertical profile of leaf area on the left. That tells you something about what types of trees, what tree sizes, what portions of the canopy are occupied when you look at it that way. If you think about the spatial heterogeneity in the horizontal plane, you can think about identifying forest gaps and understanding forest dynamics in that way. And there's a lot of ways we can use this data for this question. The other major category that we have now access to inference on is forest microclimates. And many of these microclimates are really driven by light, which influences temperature and energy balance. So we can actually model these microclimates from this sort of data. And that allows us to think about these major atmospheric functions in terms of how they originate from leaves, which allows us to understand climate drivers from the leaf and stand level up. Okay, so if we put these two different capabilities together, which we can access with a growing suite of LiDAR and multispectral approaches at multiple scales, then we can actually gain a lot of inference about the changing ecology of a region like the Amazon, which is something I often refer to as a high throughput canopy ecology because it's fast and large scale. So I've been working for years to try to develop this program, putting together remote sensing, forest measurements, and now increasingly measurements of ecophysiology and canopy leaf microenvironments. So I have like something like 15 or more papers on this. I'm not going to talk about most of it. I will very quickly highlight two things going on in the lab in this area that are major components of my work. One is this project to actually get into the canopy that I alluded to in the introduction, where we're actually climbing into trees, as highlighted here by my PhD student, Leonardo Ziccardi. For some reason, his name is not showing up at the bottom. It should be there. So this is a video of him from the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. He learned how to climb trees and is now doing a PhD working on sampling photosynthetic traits and linking those to essentially to hydrological stress tolerance to evaluate hypotheses about tree size and light environments and resilience to drought. We're also linking this to an innovative new network of leaf microclimate monitoring, where we're actually capturing temperature of leaves and air and humidity, radiation, and wind speed, many different factors associated with the microclimate at different positions in the forest canopy at sort of on a second-by-second basis that we can associate with more standard measurements of eddy covariance flux derived quantities of ecosystem exchanges. Okay, so this is funded by NASA and NSF. So I will very quickly tell you about this project, but only in summary. So finally, a major initiative is understanding the geographical ecology of the Amazon using a new database of ground-based LiDAR that we've been collecting and our colleagues have been collecting for more than 10 years. And this has been headed by Marielle. So we've put together this database of 34 sites and 354 plots where we can look at forest canopy structure variation across major environmental gradients to build a better framework for understanding future forest climate responses. And like I said, I'm going to skip over a detailed discussion of this for time. But I will say we're calculating vertical profile metrics about things like how variable the canopy is, how gappy it is, and looking at variation. This is the rainbow plot. This shows all the vertical leaf area profiles in our forests, and trying to understand what this variation tells us about forest climate responses. And I'll finish this section by saying that we have a lot of relationships between climates and canopy structural variables. So our strongest predictor of canopy structure variables, including rugosity, which is how it's the standard deviation of canopy height, so it's how variable the upper canopy is. The maximum canopy height and the leaf area index are all strongly related in just bivariate relationships with the soil fertility metric. But we actually have indications of other hydroclimate variables and radiation-related variables predicting these forest structural differences across the gradient. And so we have an even larger data set that we put together to address mechanistic questions about this. And hopefully the next time I give a Hanover, I'll tell you a lot about all of that. So that concludes the research portion of the talk. And I'll end very quickly by telling you a little bit about policy. But I do want to say, I hope I've convinced you that this perspective of linking ecological atmospheric research is critical for understanding this interplay between climate, forest, and ecological dynamics. And the function of the forest is necessary to understand how forests contribute to healthy climate functioning. I will just quickly tell you about a project that I did this summer and put it in the context of policy. So I was approached by a friend at the University of Toronto this summer, Gabriel de Oliveira, and he wanted to write something in the short letter format to Science to highlight the crisis that the Amazon was undergoing. We talked about how this is really a crisis with different intersecting problems that I think are summarized well the first sentence of the piece. And so I'll just read that to you quickly. So the combination of increasing Amazon deforestation and a specter of drought now threatens widespread fire and respiratory health risks. It could worsen the COVID pandemic, endangering all Amazonians, but particularly vulnerable traditional and rural peoples. So at the time we were predicting drought, and now we've actually seen one in the Western Amazon, and we knew that fires were going to get worse. And we know that the smoke pollution caused by fires is a risk factor for COVID outcomes. So that's what we wrote about, and it was published. Well, about a couple weeks after that, the vice president of Brazil was responding to this idea that forest fires and smoke pollution are dangerous for COVID outcomes. And he said something like, I don't know where people are getting this idea. Well, the largest news program in Brazil, the Jornal Nacional, which reaches potentially tens of millions of viewers, sort of answered that by doing a piece that focused on our paper. So these are screenshots from that piece that they did. They actually pulled up the paper and read that first sentence that I just read to you. There it is in Portuguese. And so this was a nice case where we felt like we did sort of get through to the public. We got lucky that the vice president of Brazil helped us, and that Globo decided to frame the response this way. But they went on to do a nice piece highlighting, they spoke to a respiratory health expert and one of our co-authors, Jana Anderson, there. And in any event, this really strengthened my resolve to spend the time to do the policy and the big picture work. And I'll just finish there. I will highlight the one good thing that happened in the presidential debate last week. So Joe Biden, for the second time this season, unprompted brought up rainforest conservation in the context of fighting climate change, suggesting that we needed to incentivize the reduction of deforestation in Brazil and threaten economic consequences if it was not reduced. So Biden is thinking that saving the rainforest means saving the climate. And the reason why he's thinking that is because he's been listening to the scientists. And so I think that this is a nice example of a positive outcome and for science communication actually getting it right this time. So I'll end there, and I want to thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Scott. Excellent. Very interesting. We have some questions in the chat if anybody wants to post. Okay. Scott, I'll add one thing real quick while we're waiting.
Yeah,
people a chance. It was awful generous of you to cite our work in your presentation.
Well, it fit perfectly.
One thing about it is that in actuality, the same that was true in 2014 is true in 2018, because we knew the deforestation, so we could do edge effects and isolated forest fragments up to 2018. And we know the persistence of degraded land, that is the land that doesn't get deforested, is very long, contrary to what many people have thought. And so we could actually map the persistence of those 2014 that remained in 2018. The only thing we lacked was a new fire data set or a new logging data set. So the editorial decision was to just do everything to 2014. But the trend continues. The trend is continuing. Degradation is important, and we'll have to see, because in 2019 and 2020 now, deforestation rates are creeping back up. So that offers a different cut on the degradation compared to deforestation kind of dynamic or balance. So we don't really know, but it's continuing.
Yeah, no, I'm going to be really curious to see what you guys find. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know that there were, in the period that you looked at, there's this very famous sort of success of forest conservation in Brazil, where Marina da Silva and the people that were in power at the time really reduced deforestation per se. But you guys actually really show that there was a lot of forest degradation going on at that time. And so now we have a tilt back towards deforestation. So it'll be quite interesting to see if there's some sort of trade-off going between the degradation, deforestation.
Counterintuitive, because deforestation can increase fragmentation in edges. But if deforestation is highly concentrated, then actually the geometry is such that edges go away and fragments disappear, and you get less degraded land compared to deforested land. So you actually have to measure it, I guess.
Yep.
So yeah, so that's interesting, Scott. I see there's a question that has popped up, so we can just turn it over to you, Scott, to take it
Great.
from here.
Yeah, so Rich asks, how much tree species turnover is there between the low and high water table sites, which could have implications for how these sites respond to drought? Yeah, no, that is an excellent question. I unfortunately do not have a number to cite, but there is turnover. There certainly is. And I do know actually a bit better with the understory community that there's this very significant amount of turnover between the lowland and the upland. So there is both overlap in the species that are present and some degree of turnover. We do know, I can tell you a little bit more concretely, that we know that there's a significant increase in the resilience to cavitation and xylem in the species that are in the upland. And so that's actually a result of turnover, not plasticity. So we have much more water stress resilient species in the upland than the lowland. So that's one major component of that turnover that you're asking about. So one challenge is that we don't actually have species IDs in all the sites in the data set. Well, that's something that is probably well on the way. I guess actually I should say the bigger challenge is not the species IDs, but the functional trait information, which is something that our project's going to contribute to, and we're going to be adding functional trait data to a lot of those individuals and species. Oh, yep. Thank you, Jenny.
All right. Well, we are approaching the designated end. Maybe one more short bit. We'll take one more question, if there is one.
Yeah, I'm happy to hang on if anybody else has a question.
All right. Well, Scott, that was really great, and some beautiful graphics that you have there. Some of those.
Oh, great! Thanks very much.
Yep. All right, everybody. I just want to remind everybody that we have the next Hanover seminar on October 20th, with some visitors coming in from the University of Michigan to talk about hydrology in the Amazon. And so we welcome you to come back for that, October 20th. Meanwhile, thank you, Scott. A round of applause. I don't think you can hear it, but it's there. We know it.
I appreciate that.
Thanks very much. All right, everybody.
Well,
thank you.
Thanks a lot.